Hello class, it's your instructor Sean Novak, and today we're going to learn about communication as a component of culture. Communication can take place in a variety of different ways, but its primary purpose is to transmit a message that's going to influence behavior in some way. So we're just going to kind of scratch the surface on communication today. So I want to talk about four primary ways in which communication is transmitted. And I also want to talk about three primary ways that human communication is distinct from animal communication systems. Now again, we're diving into the discipline of cultural anthropology. And in this section, it's important for us to revisit a foundation to that discipline. I want to talk about three primary ways in which human communication is distinct from animal communication. Why? Why, in talking about communication, would we need to make that kind of distinction? You may ask yourself this. Now remember that cultural anthropology, as a subdiscipline of anthropology, is a humanistic and a holistic discipline. Anthropology aims to understand human activity in its entirety, from its ancient roots. Now, you might recall, right, that the discipline is grounded in a scientific ideology, right? Which, when they talk about the roots of human development and human creation, they're talking about it from a perspective of the theory of evolution. So in order to understand how humans evolved in our entirety, from that perspective, they would look at how we evolved from certain animals. Now again, this is a place where I'm not trying to convince you one way or the other. There's a variety of different perspectives on how humans came to be. But in order to understand why the discipline of cultural anthropology would compare human and animal communication, we have to remind ourselves that it's grounded in the theory of evolution. Okay, but before we get into those particular comparisons, let's talk a little bit about the four primary ways in which communication can be transmitted. I remember these in one of two ways. One, I remember Vato, V-A-T-O. Or I always remember this sentence, Vinny always tumbles outside. Vinny's clumsy. And that's simply Vinny, V, always, A, tumbles, T, outside, O. So V-A-T-O stands for visual, audio, tactile, and olfactory. Visual is obviously, right, by sight. Audio, well actually it's auditory, not audio. Auditory is by hearing. Tactile is by touch. We communicate by touching. And olfactory is by smelling. We can communicate from odors. Cultural anthropologists believe that all animal species, right, send consistent messages to communicate through these four primary ways. Well, they don't necessarily have to be sent. They're received too, right? So we transmit communicative messages through those four ways. For example, if somebody were to just stick their middle finger at you in the United States, that sends a particular message. The dominant perspective, right, is that it's a way of cursing at you just by a symbol. In many facets of the United States, it's seen in a negative fashion, right? Like it's an insult. However, it's not always seen that way, right? There are different cultures, right, or families, whatnot, right, that might see it differently. For example, I come from a family where there's a lot of family photos that you see my aunts, my uncles, even my grandma and my grandpa flicking off the camera. From the outside in, it may come off as aggressive, or if we hate one another, or we're always angry, but that's not true. For us, it was simply kind of a tongue-in-cheek way to take a form of expression and flip it on its head to say hello. But regardless of whether or not you see it positively or negatively, the point is that it communicates a message and it transmits a message to be received and sent. And in and of itself means nothing, but the culture, right? Because culture is symbolic and it consists of symbols, culture defines what the symbol means. Now think about auditory, right? Here, we send and receive messages based off of what we hear. For example, when I was a young boy, if I heard my mother say Shawn Michael, she used my middle name, I was in trouble. If she said, Shawn Michael, get your butt over here, I knew I was in trouble. I could hear it in her voice. Or another example might be, let's say you're in class and the kid in the back of the room farted. And it was one of those farts that you heard, right? I mean, it probably communicates something through the olfactory too, right? Because you smell it. But it would communicate something that the smelly kid's in the back of the room farting. I don't know what he ate, but we could hear it. And we might laugh, right? Or some might be disgusted. But it would break a social norm in the classroom, that's for sure. Yeah, I did that in a meeting once with coworkers, and there was nowhere to run. I just said, I got nothing for you. But we all had a good laugh. And me being me, I really wasn't that embarrassed. Now, we take tactile, right? Which is touch. We can communicate by touching. For example, when I walk into the door after seeing my mom, or not seeing my mom for a few months, I give her the biggest hug in the world. She knows it's love. Right? In my family, one expression to physically, tactile, right? Expression of love is to give a hug and a kiss. Now, we could also communicate in a not so pleasant way by using tactile form of communication, right? Let's say I'm a father and I have a daughter, and my daughter is being hit on by a young man. And that young man, let's say, goes to my church. And when I see the young man at church, I walk up to him and I put my hand on the back of his neck, but in a firm way. And I say to him as I have my hand firmly on the back of his neck, "Hello, Billy. I heard you met my daughter over the weekend." Well, obviously, he could probably hear a certain sarcasm or irritation through the auditory communication, the way that the tone, but the firm grasp on the back of his neck is going to communicate something to him that he understands that I'm not pleased. Now, obviously, I wouldn't do that. I don't even have a daughter. But, and that's probably a little bit too passive-aggressive for me. But you get the point, right? We can communicate through touch, right? We can communicate, transmit messages, whether it's a loving hug to our mother or a firm grasp on the back of Billy's neck. I probably sound like when I become a father one day, I'm going to be a very protective father. I'll probably find different ways of communicating those messages. And then the fourth one that we talked about, olfactory, right? By smell. We can receive messages through smell. Well, we talked about one earlier, right? We were talking about how we can visually communicate, or not visually, auditory, right? Communicate something. Remember we were talking about the kid that farted in class, right? You can actually communicate something by sending a smell to somebody. Let's say that you're in an elevator with somebody who you don't really care for. You both get in on the first floor. You're going up to the third floor, and this other person is going to go up to the 13th floor. And you know this, right? Because when you got into the elevator, you asked them, "What floor are you going to?" And then they said, "Going to the 13th floor." And you don't really like them, right? Maybe they're real arrogant, right? They think that they're the bee's knees. So your floor comes, right? And you getting ready to get off the third floor, but right before you get off the third floor, you drop a bomb. Now, of course, I wouldn't do that, and I wouldn't recommend that you do that either. I'm not endorsing that, but I'm just saying that could be a way of communicating displeasure for that person. And the message that you sent to them through olfactory would resonate with them for 10 floors. Now, let's try to use maybe a less repulsive example. A different example might be when we smell barbecue, right? You know that smell? You smell it in the air and you said, some got some goods cooking. You might even follow the smell, right? Show up at somebody's barbecue. Act like you're their cousin. Now, here's the thing, is that human communication and animal communication is very different, though. They can both communicate through these 4 different ways. And they have to learn how to communicate amongst the same species, at least, right? Because their survival is contingent on it. But non-human animals, the way that they communicate is extremely limited in its capacity compared to ours. In fact, they use communication called call systems, C-A-L-L, call systems. And they're usually using calls, right, these sounds to respond to situations in the immediate. And they use these calls to communicate about things, about specific events that are usually in the here and now. But with human language, whether we're speaking it or we're using hand signals or we're writing, is much, much more complex. We can communicate whole thought patterns and experiences in ways that non-human animals cannot. There is potentially an unlimited variety of ways that we can adjust and adapt our language to communicate different things. There's a very easy way to remember the 3 distinct ways that human language is different from non-human animal language. Remember we had the sentence, right? Vinny always tumbles outside. Well, we know Vinny's clumsy and he hurts himself because he always tumbles outside. Let's say somebody finds Vinny. He had fell right outside because he always tumbles. And Peter's over there. And somebody said, can Peter dial 911? This is what you got to remember. Can Peter dial? CPD. The 911 is irrelevant. It's just part of the story, right? So Vinny always tumbles outside. Can Peter dial 911? And that CPD, can Peter dial? CPD stands for conventionality, productivity, and displacement. You see, those are the 3 ways in which human communication is distinct from non-human animal communication. So what do we mean by those? Well, let's start off with conventionality. And that is essentially the association between a meaningful sequence of sounds with either an object, an action, or an idea. So we have these different sounds, we put them together, they have a meaning that describes something. You see, words stand for something. Why? Because as humans, we say that they do. Words are culturally and socially constructed by humans. And the same word can mean different things depending on that culture. Words are nothing more than a symbol. In and of themselves, they're a symbol, or they might not even be a symbol, right? We make them a symbol and we give them meaning. See, next there's productivity. This is also called openness. As humans, we can and we do consistently forge new combinations of words that make new meanings. It really is an idea that highlights the flexibility and the capability of us to just consistently create new stuff. Through language, that is. We can find ways, new ways to describe things in the past. We could create entirely new words of things in the present or the future. And this idea is kind of hinting on that last component, D, which is displacement. You see, unlike non-human animals, we have the ability to communicate about things that aren't in our immediate environment. Like, remember when I was using the example for tactile communication about grasping the back of Billy's neck? That whole mixture of tactile and auditory communication was communicating a discontent about something that previously happened. Based off the best knowledge that we currently have through cultural, anthropological, and anthropological work, animals can't communicate that way. You see, non-human animals often communicate about danger or threat in the here and now. I saw it. You know, my dog comes up to me and begins to wag her tail and whimper because maybe she's hungry right now or she has to pee right now. She's not trying to, plan out the shopping list for tomorrow. See, as you can see, language, especially for humans, well, not especially for humans, but for humans is extremely important. Without it, we wouldn't be able to socialize our children, we wouldn't be able to transmit culture. We use language to help young children understand the values and beliefs and norms of our culture. And depending on our group of people, right, we might have certain standards or certain norms for how to communicate. And how we communicate, the norms and the rules in doing that, and the meaning to the words that come out of our mouth, help us establish a common understanding of the world around us and our place in it. So we typically have what is called a speech community. It's important to remember, a speech community, right? And this is a group of people, right, who share those norms, right, those rules in language and how to communicate. You see, for humans, there is no biological drive to learn a particular language. Well, let me be clear. There's no biological drive or basis to learn one particular language over another. But of course, we're going to learn the language of those who are being socialized among. Now, although we might speak different languages, some do believe that there is what's called a universal grammar. And what that means is they believe that there's at least a basic set of conditions, principles, and rules that underlie all languages. Noam Chomsky was a pioneer of this idea of the universal grammar. He believed that although there's no biological basis to prefer one language over the other, but he believed that instinctive universal grammars were something that we were born with, at least. And this is where we would get into basically the instinct of how we structure languages. But we're not going to get into detail of that today. So I'm going to leave you with that, and then we'll pick up in another lecture about how languages are structured. So that's that. Until next time, I'll see you again.